Welcome back to Revenant Sound Studios. Today I'm going to be giving you guys a tutorial on how I like to mix drums. The way I like to approach this is what's called the top-down method. Basically, you start off with kind of like the last place in line and kind of work your way backwards. In this case, I'm starting with the mix bus right here. And actually, let me play these drums for you first. Cool. So you can see that we have a pretty good amount of processing going on here with different plugins. So let me actually bypass all this first. Cool. So yeah, pretty big difference as you can hear. So in top-down mixing, the top-down method, in this case I'm starting off with the mix bus, and this would also have all the other instruments going on, but since I'm just focusing on drums right now, I'll just get started with this. So on the mix bus, since everything is coming out of the mix bus, I have a few different things that I did here, and my first thing is an EQ. This EQ is just rolling off some sub low end that I don't really need. Then we have a SSL style bus compressor. Doing about 2 dB of compression, pretty standard. I always put this on my mix bus. And next up we have Slate Digital VMR. And over here I'm using this custom lift processor to just add a very tiny bit of sub low end to it. And we also have Revival adding just a tiny bit of top end. Bypass this. So very subtle. It becomes more obvious as more mix elements come in. And finally, I have another EQ. And what I'm doing here is actually I'm rolling off everything up until 120 hertz on the side information. So you have the mid information and you have the side information, and this FabFilter Pro Q2 has a mid-side mode. So this is pretty much just taking off everything that's on the sides. Like, you don't really want much low end on the sides. You want to really keep it more in the center or in the mid information. So moving along, before that we actually are hitting the drums bus, which doesn't have anything on it at this time. I normally would put a compressor on there, another SSL style, but I've actually started doing that on a shells bus, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Since the shells bus comes in before the drums bus, I have this Waves SSL style compressor. With pretty much very similar settings to this one on the mix bus. And the reason that I put this compressor on the shells bus, and the shells bus actually is where the toms, the snare, and the kick are all routing to, pretty much everything that isn't cymbals. And the cymbals, since I just have overheads for that, that's just going straight to the drums bus. And I actually prefer putting this compressor on the shells bus because it doesn't, I just really want it to affect the shells. I don't want it to make the cymbals sound weird when the kick hits or the snare hits. I just feel like it has more control this way. So this is already just getting some glue and some compression going for the drums. Let me bypass it. And with it. So still pretty subtle. We have some more Slate VMR here. We have an EQ, FGN. It's doing just a bit of top end boost around 12K, a top shelf. And it's taking out some boxiness around 560 hertz. It's bypass it. And with it. So just kind of giving it a bit more top, taking out some boxiness. Here's Slate's Revival, just adding a pretty good amount of top end to it. Without it. So it's already getting those shells kind of brighter and better sounding altogether without even EQing any of the tracks individually. And before that, I'm going to start with the kick. So the kick bus, the snare bus, and the toms bus is feeding into the shells bus, and the individual tracks are going to those, like kicks going to kick, snare tracks are going to snare, toms are going to toms. So I'll start with the kick track, and I have absolutely nothing going on here, just probably using this as a spectrum analyzer. For the kick, this was the live kick drum. And so I did some EQ here. Rolling off some sub low end, taking out quite a bit of mid-range around 500 hertz, really big scoop. Without it. And some Slate FG401 doing some compression. About 3 dB on average. Just getting the kick to have a little bit more of a snap to it and getting those transients in control. And for the kick, I felt like this live kick drum just didn't really have enough for me, so I decided to use a sample along with it. And right here I have Trigger 2 from Slate Digital, and this is one of the stock kicks. I think the first kick drum that it comes with. Kick 1. And with this I did some EQ, quite a bit of cutting here. So as you can hear, it's quite the big difference. And there really isn't much of a strategy here. I just kind of went in and took out a lot of stuff that I felt didn't sound right, and I was just really shaping the kick to sound more along the lines of how I'd like it to be. And next up we have Slate VMR again. And I'm using the VCC channel on the Trident setting, which has given it a bit more of a scoop and a bit more of a hi-fi sound. Here's with it. Without it. So pretty subtle, but it's definitely like getting the kick to sound more along the lines of how I like it. And we have more EQ here, which is kind of overkill, but I am doing a boost around 8K. Just get a little bit more top out of it, taking out a little bit of boxiness around 1K here. And I'm taking out a pretty good amount of mid-range around 745 hertz. So minus 11 dB, so quite a bit. And actually still rolling off a little bit more. This is probably totally unnecessary without it. So it's really just doing a lot more of what the first EQ was doing. Finally, I have this EQ, the FG401 again. Just doing a bit of compression. And this is both kicks together, live and sampled. So very clean kick drum sound. Next up, we have the snare. So I have a snare live track and a snare sample. I'm going to start with the live track. That's coming out of this snare bus, which is then going to the shells bus, and then finally out of the drums bus. So on the snare bus, we have VCC channel again. And again with the Trident setting, doing a bit of that scoop thing and adding a bit of a hi-fi sound to it. And then we have FGN here doing some top boost and taking out a bit more of that boxiness and adding a pretty good amount of low to low mid information here at 130 hertz without it. And finally we have FG401, which isn't doing too much with just this one snare. And then we have JST Clip, which is an awesome plugin. It's basically just chopping off the excessive transient just to kind of get the snare to play more nicely with the bus compression, and it still has a nice punchy sound to it without overloading your bus compressor or your limiter. So it's a really great tool. Very simple tool. And that's the snare bus. Let me now move along to the live track for the snare. So we have an EQ here, just rolling off some low end and some top end. It's probably had a little bit too much cymbal bleed, so just thought I'd kind of get rid of that here. Next up, we have a gate. I really like using this plugin, the channel strip it's a stock Pro Tools plugin. And what's great about it is that it has this detector area. By default it's set to average, but when you set it to peak, it really catches all the transients really well, and to make sure that it doesn't sound weird. I've worked with a bunch of gate plugins that I feel like they always cut off the transient. But anyways, this is with it and without it. So it's definitely cutting out a lot of bleed. It's kind of choking the snare drum a little bit, but I'm going to compensate for that with some reverb. Next up, we have Slate VMR again. Some EQ, which is actually taking out there might be a bit of a ring here that I'm taking out, and adding some more low end. Up next, we have FG Stress, which is one of my favorite plugin compressors. So we have it on a 6:1 ratio, kind of about medium to fast attack, medium release. Without it. So it's given the snare that snap, and it's kind of extending the snare a little bit more, which is really great. So it's already getting the snare to sound the way I want it to sound. And finally, we have JST Clip again, just trying to get that transient under control. While this isn't a bad sounding snare, I did feel that for the song, it needed a much more powerful and big sounding snare, so I decided to add in a sample. And this is Slate Trigger, and this is a room sample, but it's just like already very processed, and it sounds kind of exaggerated, but this is how it sounds. So yeah, like huge snare sound, huge decay and everything. I have a EQ here, getting it a little bit under control. Yeah, so pretty significant. Took out like some boxiness, bit of a ring. This is probably not even on. And I'm using this like side EQ just to take out some of the low end from this snare sample from the sides. I want to keep the snare more like focused in the center. So here are both the live snare and the triggered snare. And just the live snare. So pretty huge difference. This sample is like just making a very huge difference in the sound, and it's kind of exaggerated, but it really fits for the style of music. And I just felt like it called for a huge fat drum sound. And for my reverb, I actually like to use this IK Multimedia CSR plate Classic Studio Reverb. I don't know anybody else that uses these, but it's actually a really cool plugin. And this is pretty much my go-to reverb for snare and toms. And I just have a preset that I start with, and then maybe I'll tweak it a little bit. Usually what I find myself tweaking is this EQ. Without reverb. So giving it a bit of decay, and I'm just taking out some more boxiness and rolling off some top, rolling off some bottom, and using this mid-side EQ section to kind of control how much of that low end in the snare I want in the mids or the sides. So this gives me a lot more flexibility to kind of get the reverb under control. So it's really cool. And I actually almost forgot to mention the snare bottom. I love working with snare bottom. It's actually one of the best tools to have when you actually record. I know some people don't record snare bottom, and I think they should, because it really helps to capture more of the real picture of the snare. I mean, obviously that doesn't sound all that great. It just sounds like snare wires, but the way that I approach the bottom snare is that it kind of captures a lot more of that top end of the snare. And when you combine it with the actual snare top, you don't end up having to boost too much top end on the snare, because pretty much what almost always happens on the snare top is once you boost too much top end, those cymbals or the hi-hat just get out of control in that track. So I try to only boost as much as I can and kind of use the snare, the top mic, more for like the body and the overall snare sound. And I like to add more top end with the snare bottom, and if I need to, I'll add a sample to just kind of finish off the sound. So over here on the snare bottom, I have the gate once again. And I have an EQ, which is just rolling off some low end. And I have a compressor. This is Slate Digital's The Monster compressor, which is awesome because it's free. And it's basically 1176 with all the buttons in. Probably has like some other features going on. It's become my favorite snare bottom compressor. It just sounds really good. So it kind of like extends that snare sound, almost kind of giving it a bit of a reverb kind of sound. And this is going to the reverb, of course. So with the top snare, just the top snare, and with this bottom snare, just kind of completes the sound a little bit more. Ultimately, I felt that I needed to use a sample though. Cool. So moving on to the toms. So my toms are going out of this toms bus, which actually has quite a bit going on here. Let's start off with an EQ, just rolling off some low end. And I felt that they had a little bit too much low end to them, too much like oomph to them. So I already took out a good amount on all the toms. And we have JST clip, which is pretty much just clipping them like crazy, just to pretty much kind of flatten them out, get them under control already. We have VMR, starting off with VCC channel on the Trident setting, doing that kind of mid scoop and kind of giving it more of a hi-fi. And using Revival to add quite a bit of top end to these toms. And finally FG401 to get some compression. And without it. So it's louder, but it's kind of getting the toms sounding more processed. And next up in line is the lo-fi plugin, which is actually a really cool trick that I learned. The lo-fi is basically a saturation plugin, and it's a stock plugin in Pro Tools. So it has a bunch of different settings, but pretty much when you put it on something like toms or the snare drum, it kind of adds like some more fatness to it and a bit more top end to it. So it's a pretty interesting sound. This is without it. And with it. So it did make it louder, but it's pretty much just, it's adding a bit of a subtle like top end saturation, which sounds really cool. And that's it for the toms bus. These are going to my drum verb. On the individual tracks, I have a gate. I always edit my toms, so I pretty much like to take out any bleed. I don't usually like to use a gate on them because they're just too dynamic throughout the song, and I feel like one gate setting is never going to work for every tom hit, so I just prefer to clean them all up and just kind of edit them manually. Sometimes, in case I forgot to add a little fade in, this gate kind of catches that so that I don't hear any clicks or pops. So that's pretty much what all this gate is doing. And right here we have VMR, and we just have a SSL style EQ, and that's just doing a bit of shaping without it. So it's pretty drastic. Looks like I'm automating the top end here, and I'm taking out quite a bit of boxiness, around 800 hertz and around 300 hertz, which are pretty common areas where you might want to scoop for toms. And I'm actually taking out some low end and rolling off some low ends because I guess they probably just sounded a little too boomy. So pretty big difference in sound. And I pretty much have the same thing going on for all the other toms. This EQ is very similar, it just might vary. So I'm not really going to go over every single tom. Whoops. And without the EQ. So pretty big difference in sound. Finally, we have the overheads, which are actually the most important track, because unless you have rooms, but really the overheads are kind of like the full picture of your drum set. This is a metal track, so for metal, a lot of guys like to use the overheads just as cymbal mics, and for the most part that is what I'm doing, but I do definitely like to have some toms and snare in there just to kind of give more of that real sound, because I mean direct tracks sometimes just sound too processed, and unless you have like at least some good overheads or some room tracks, it just doesn't sound like a very natural drum set. The way I usually approach this is, in this case, so those are the raw overheads, which actually sound quite good. They're actually not bad at all. Usually the biggest problem is that the cymbals are just over the top, like with harshness, and they're really piercing, and so they're not bad. The snare drum had a bit too much of a peak in there, so I like to use something like an L1 limiter to just kind of like trim that snare peak down, but it's a very subtle thing that it does, and it's like a very fast compressor. It's just a brick wall limiter, but it kind of just chops off that snare peak without affecting anything else really. After that, we have an EQ, which looks a little crazy, but this is actually a pretty gentle EQ compared to how I might actually EQ other overhead tracks because of how harsh they can sound without it. So starting from the top, a lot of times I like to do a roll off here around maybe 20 kilohertz, just to kind of like get a little bit of that like extra top end that can get a little harsh. Usually like to reserve some of that for the lead vocal. I did some rolling off of the low end, And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of metal guys, they might like to actually roll off all the way up to maybe 500 hertz because they're like, well, what do you need anything down here for if you just need the cymbals? But the thing is, cymbals have frequencies that kind of go all the way down to, you know, like the low mids. So when you roll that off, I feel like the top end and the top mids can get pretty harsh because you just don't have that balance of the low mids with the high mids and the highs. So it's always good to like keep some in there. And instead of rolling off, I'll just use some EQ moves to actually notch out certain things. Like if the snare is a little too, if the kick drum is a little bit too boomy there, I can just kind of notch that out without having to just roll everything off all the way over here just to kind of get rid of the kick drum. So on top of that, another thing that I've learned is that if you roll off your overheads way too high, it's going to affect the phase with other microphones, like the snare, for example. Your snare might go out of phase with the overheads once you roll it off too high. So I try to not go above 60 hertz, and that's usually where I set it these days. Other than that, taking out some boxiness and just a few little harsh frequencies. There's a bit of a resonance there. A bit of like a harsh area here, and just notching out a few little things. So that's pretty much the overhead EQ. Lastly, I have this compressor, the IK Multimedia Opto compressor, and stereo compressor, but I actually don't have the left and right linked. I have them pretty much working independently. So as you can see, they're kind of working differently. And the reason I did that is because you have crash hits on the left, crash hits on the right, and I just kind of wanted to control those, get those balanced out without affecting the other side. That works pretty cool, and it also increases the sustain of the cymbals, which is really cool. And finally, in here, I'm sending this to a pretty much like a fake drum room without it. So it's adding a bit of a room sound to it because I didn't have a room track to work with. And I'm pretty much just sending the overheads, and I'm actually sending the toms to this as well. And all this is the Deverb from Pro Tools, very standard basic reverb plugin on a room setting. Just kind of tweaked it to taste. And that's just kind of giving it a bit of a bigger sound. So all together, that's pretty much the entire drum mix here. And this is how it sounds with all the processing. And let me bypass all this stuff for you guys one more time. Oops. And back on. So there you have it. As you can hear, it's quite a big difference compared to the raw sound. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's typically how I approach mixing drums, especially for rock and especially for metal. I always try to utilize as much of the live performance as possible without having to use samples, but sometimes you got to use samples just to get the right sound. Yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. If you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like. And if you guys haven't already, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Got a lot more tutorials and really cool videos coming out, so stay tuned for all that stuff. See you guys next time.